Welcome back to Harbour Unboxed. Today, I finally got my hands on the new 6GB version of the GeForce RTX 3050. See, it says 6GB right there. I'm not making it up. It really is a 6GB version of the RTX 3050. After all of these years, who would have expected that? And for whatever reason, this model was quite slow making its way down to Australia. But we have it now, and I'm very keen to test this little guy out and see what it has to offer. And for a few reasons, which I guess I'll go over before we get into the review, because this will sort of be a review that I have to approach from a few different angles. Firstly, we'll get the dodgy naming out of the way. The 6GB RTX 3050 isn't simply that. The original RTX 3050 8GB with just 2GB of VRAM missing. Rather, it is a completely cut down product in basically every way possible. Whereas the original model was released 2 years ago now and was based on Go106 silicon, the new 6GB variant uses the smaller Go107 silicon, which is almost 30% smaller. The result is a 10% reduction in core count with 2 fewer SM units, and of course this means there's 10% fewer tensor cores and RT cores. The cores are also clocked 17% lower, dropping the boost from 1777 MHz to just 1470 MHz, and this has been done to lower the TDP, but we'll talk more about that in a moment. Before that though, let's talk about the 6GB VRAM buffer. Whereas the 8GB model uses a 128-bit wide memory bus, the 6GB version is missing a 2GB chip, and that reduces the bus to 96-bit wide, while also cutting the memory bandwidth by 25% to 168GB per second. Now, all of these downgrades have seen the TDP slashed by 31% from 130 watts to just 70 watts. And that's an important change, as it means the RTX 3050 6GB doesn't require external power, and we'll talk more about that in a moment. But first, the dodgy naming. Although the 6 and 8GB versions of the RTX 3050 share the same name, as we've just talked about, they're not even remotely close to being the same product, using entirely different silicon. So while potential buyers might think they're getting the original RTX 3050 with just 2GB of VRAM lopped off, they're actually getting an entirely different product that's going to be a good bit slower. And this is obviously very anti-consumer and not something that we like to see, so that alone spoils the 6GB RTX 3050 for us. And I think it's reasonable to suggest that such a product should never have been called an RTX 3050, and instead should have been called something like an RTX 3040 or maybe even a 3040 Ti. So we're certainly not giving Nvidia a pass here. The naming is atrocious. But it's not another GT 1030 DDR4 situation either. Naming aside, we might actually have a relatively good product on our hands. And this is for two reasons. Firstly, the RTX 3050 8GB is meant to be $250 US, but it almost never sold at that price. And even today, it still costs over $300, making it laughably bad in terms of value. The 6GB version though, it has an MSRP of $170 US and right now can be found for $180 US. That's pretty close to the MSRP, and it's 28% less than that of the 8GB MSRP and over 40% less than what you'll actually pay for an 8GB model. So the pricing does look decent, but the other positive here is power usage. With a TDP of just 70 watts, the 6GB RTX 3050 doesn't require external PCI Express power. Rather, all the power it requires can be fed through the PCIe slot. Now, for the vast majority of you, this isn't really great news, as feeding in a 6 or 8 pin PCIe power connector, it's no big deal, and the difference between 70 watts or 130 watts is inconsequential. But for those of you who have picked up something like a cheap Dell Optiplex system, for example, the 6GB RTX 3050 could be a game changer. And that's because these Office-type PCs feature proprietary power supplies that generally don't include PCIe power, so installing something like a Radeon RX 6600 can be quite tricky. But this is an extremely niche use case, and as far as I'm concerned, in most instances it doesn't really make sense. Moreover, the tech-savvy amongst you will be able to get something like a Radeon RX 6600 working in such a system, either by purchasing an ATX wiring adapter so you can use a normal power supply, or by jerry-rigging your own power supply to the graphics card, and there are several low-cost and effective ways in which this can be done, sometimes using a DC power pack that you might already have, and there are some really great YouTube videos on how to do this. So while the 6GB RTX 3050 is now the world's fastest gaming graphics card that doesn't require external power, that's not necessarily a title that'll mean much to most of you, but we will certainly consider that angle all the same as we review this product. Ultimately, what will matter for most of you is the performance the 6GB RTX 3050 delivers for $180 US. Can it compete with the slightly more expensive Radeon RX 6600? There's also the 8GB version of the 6500 XT, but spoiler alert, while worlds better than the 4GB version, it still kind of sucks and just isn't worth buying over the RX 6600. So for testing, we're using our Ryzen 7 7800X 3D test system with 32GB of DDR5 6000 memory using the latest display drivers. All data has been validated and updated for this video, and all GPUs have been tested at the base spec. In total, I've tested 13 games at 1080p using the appropriate quality settings. So let's take a look at what we have. First up, we have Remnant II, and here the 6GB 3050 is just 14% slower than the original version, which admittedly is a big margin for two products that share the same name, but based on the specs you might have expected to see a bigger gap between the two. It was slightly slower than the 8GB version of the 6500 XT, but also a whopping 46% faster than the RX 6400, which is AMD's fastest GPU that doesn't require external power. But if you don't care about external power, then I think trailing the RX 6600 by a 35% margin will be problematic for the 6GB RTX 3050. Testing with The Last of Us Part 1, we again find that the 6GB RTX 3050 isn't much slower than the 8GB model, as we have another example where it is 14% slower. It's also offering twice the performance of the RX 6400, though it is almost 30% slower than the RX 6600. In Starfield, the 6GB RTX 3050 was good for 36 FPS on average using the lowest quality settings at 1080p, making it 16% slower than the RTX 3050 8GB, but almost 40% faster than the RX 6400. Again though, it was a little over 30% slower than the RX 6600. This time, when testing with Resident Evil 4, we do find that the 6GB version of the RTX 3050 is 23% slower than the 8GB model, and that saw it match the performance of the 4GB 6500 XT, which did make it 27% faster than the RX 6400. That said though, it was a massive 54% slower than the RX 6600, as the RDNA 2 GPU performs really well in this title. And we do see instances where similar spec RDNA 2 GPUs can match or even beat RDNA 3, and this is one such example. Next, we have Ratchet and Clank Rift Apart, and here the 6GB RTX 3050 rendered 61 FPS on average, making it 21% slower than the 8GB model and 41% slower than the RX 6600. But when compared to the RX 6400, it was a massive 56% faster, so a big upgrade there for those needing a GPU without external power. Testing with Star Wars Jedi Survivor saw the 6GB model come in 22% slower than the original, with just 45 FPS on average, but even so, that did make it a massive 32% faster than AMD's RX 6400. But for those of you wanting the most bang for your buck, and external power is not an issue, then the RX 6600 will offer nearly 40% more performance in this title for roughly the same dollars. Moving on to Forza Motorsport, we find fairly similar performance between the 6 and 8GB models, with the cheaper 6GB version trailing by 11%. That meant it was 62% faster than the RX 6400, an incredible uplift, though it was still 24% slower than the RX 6600. Next up, we have Cyberpunk 2077 Phantom Liberty, and here the 6GB 3050 rendered 58 FPS on average, making it 24% slower than the original 8GB model. So, pretty big drop off there, but even so, it still completely and utterly annihilated the RX 6400, offering 71% more performance. It was still 36% slower than the RX 6600, so again, if you can provide external power, it looks like the 6600 is still the best value option right now. Hogwarts Legacy sees the 6GB RTX 3050 only keeping pace with the 4GB 6500 XT, and that meant it was 20% slower than the original 8GB version, but still 31% faster than the RX 6400. But again, if you don't require a GPU with external power requirements, then the RX 6600 is delivering almost 60% more performance for roughly the same price. So as to which option is best will depend entirely on your use case. This time, when testing with Avatar, we again find that the 6GB model is 22% slower than the original, which is quite a large margin. But because the game seems to use some form of ray tracing, even with the lowest possible quality settings, the RX 6400 gets completely smashed. And as a result, the 6GB 3050 was almost twice as fast. But again, it was still 33% slower than the RX 6600. Testing with Assassin's Creed Mirage, we find that the 6GB RTX 3050 is good for 70 FPS on average, which is around what you can expect from the Arc A580 and RX 5500 XT. In this example, it was just 15% faster than the RX 6400, which is still a decent margin, but it is small relative to what we've seen in almost every other title tested. Next up, we have Alan Wake 2, and here the 6GB RTX 3050 was good for just 31 FPS on average, so not amazing performance given that we're at 1080p, using the lowest possible quality settings, but it is still 55% faster than the RX 6400, despite being 23% slower than the 8GB model. Finally, we have Counter-Strike 2, and here the 6GB version is 15% slower than the original, with 178 FPS on average, so great performance overall. That said, you can expect this level of performance from the 6500 XT, the 4GB version, and even the older 5500 XT. But amazingly, it's still a 16% boost over the RX 6400. Okay, so here's the 13 game average, and on average, the 6GB RTX 3050 was 18% slower than the 8GB model, so not a small margin, and certainly unacceptable considering they share the same name. The 6GB version was also slightly slower than the 8GB 6500 XT, but 25% faster than the 4GB version, and as we found in our recent video, 4GB of VRAM just isn't enough for modern gaming, even at 1080p using the lowest quality settings. Then, when compared to AMD's fastest GPU that doesn't require external power, so the RX 6400, the 6GB 3050 is a whopping 50% faster. So Nvidia really has smashed AMD out of the park on this one. Really, AMD only wins for those of you who want a game on a budget and BYO PCIe power connectors, as the RX 6600 is 53% faster than the 6GB 3050, which will almost certainly make it better value, and let's go look at that now. As we expected, the RX 6600 retains its crown as the best value entry-level gaming GPU, given that the 6GB RTX 3050 costs a whopping 38% more per frame, so unless you require it for a low-powered application, the new GeForce GPU is terrible value, at least relative to the RX 6600. You could also argue that for those of you who have the option of external PCIe power, the 8GB version of the 6500 XT is also better value, costing 14% less per frame, and overall it was technically just a little bit faster. It also packs an extra 2GB of VRAM, but like the RX 6400, it is limited to just 2 display outputs, PCIe x 4 bandwidth, and it completely lacks hardware encoding. So for me personally, the small saving the 8GB 6500 XT offers, if it indeed does hit shelves at $160 US, because it's not on sale at the time of making this video, but if it doesn't hit that price, it just won't be worth it. And $160 US is meant to be the starting price, so AMD's informed me. So really anything over that, it's just a complete write-off. Now, for low-powered applications, it's technically only slightly better value than the RX 6400, but given the Radeon GPU only averaged 40 FPS and the 6GB 3050 was good for 60 FPS, I'd say it's much better value than what even the cost per frame suggests. The GeForce GPU also has more VRAM, twice the PCIe bandwidth, it supports more than 2 display outputs, and includes hardware encoding, so all up, it's just a much better value product in my opinion. Then when compared to the 8GB RTX 3050, the new 6GB version is almost 30% better value per frame, so a massive improvement there, and while I hate the naming structure that Nvidia's gone with here, as it is very much anti-consumer, at least the nasty surprise here ends up being better value, even if it's a good bit slower. So it is difficult to go hard on them here, even if it is a bit dodgy. Now here's a quick look at total system draw. Interestingly, in Cyberpunk 2077, the 6GB 3050 and 4GB 6500 XT consume a similar level of power, or at least total system power consumption was similar. Consumption was also 20% higher than that of the RX 6400, but performance was also 71% greater. So in terms of efficiency, the Radeon GPU gets annihilated, and really so too does the 4GB 6500 XT. For the most part, we're looking at similar margins in Assassin's Creed Mirage. Again, the 6GB 3050 saw similar power draw to that of the 6500 XT, and it was 6% faster in this title. Then when compared to the RX 6400, power draw for the 6GB 3050 was 13% higher, but performance was also 15% greater. So efficiency is significantly better for AMD in this title. Not significantly better than what we're seeing from the GeForce GPUs, just significantly better when compared to the results we saw on Cyberpunk 2077, to be clear on that one. Now, for a quick look at operating temperatures and clock speeds. And for all of this testing, we purchased the MSI Ventus 2X version of the 6GB RTX 3050. After an hour of load in an enclosed ATX case with an ambient room temperature of 21 degrees, we saw a peak hotspot temperature of 72 degrees, which is good, though the 2000 RPM fan speed was a little loud and the card could clearly be heard over our case fans. In this test, we saw an average clock speed of 1650 MHz, and the memory ran at the expected 1750 MHz. As for overclocking, there is absolutely no headroom here, as you are limited by power delivery through the PCIe slot. The power slider is locked at 100%, and even trying to squeeze out just an extra 100 MHz resulted in crashes. So there you have it, the RTX 3050 6GB. And I do have mixed feelings about this little guy, as cute as it is, or cursed, depending on how you view it. Anyway, obviously, I absolutely hate the name. Calling this thing an RTX 3050 is extremely misleading. Now, the RTX 3050 was released 2 years ago now using G106 silicon, and it's pretty well established at this point. Most people know how an RTX 3050 performs, and if you go and research how an RTX 3050 performs on the internets, you'll generally find better performance than you will for the 6GB model. And a lot of people might not even know that there is a 6GB model. So to go and muddy the waters with the G107 part is very scummy. Of course, it's not just Nvidia who plays funny buggers with product names. Recently, AMD pulled a really confusing one with their Ryzen 7 5700, which isn't just a slightly underclocked 5700X, like what we see with the 5600 to the 5600X, for example. Instead, it's a 5700G with the iGPU disabled, making it a much slower part when it comes to gaming, and much slower than what the name would suggest. But anyway, we have seen a lot of this from Nvidia over the years, and some examples have been much more egregious than others. In the case of the 6GB RTX 3050, it is certainly one of the better examples, and it's actually quite a good product. In fact, it would be a great product if it had been called the RTX 3040. Now, when I say good product, generally speaking, look, it's decent. For it to be good or great, you really need to be interested in its ability to operate without external power, which admittedly is a very niche use case, or at least it is in our opinion, but the ability exists, even if I believe there are better ways to tackle such setups, which I mentioned earlier in the video. So as a typical gaming product, it's not bad, but it's certainly not great either. For just $20 US more, the Radeon RX 6600 is worlds better, offering on average a little over 50% more performance. It has a bit more VRAM and just offers a better gaming experience overall. You can even tackle 1440p, so in my opinion that's worth the 10% premium or thereabouts. So there you have it, that's another, I'd just like to make an amendment to this content. It doesn't stand up, so I don't know who that's going to be a problem for. I mean, it's certainly a problem for me right now. Beyond that, unclear. So I'll just lay it down and wrap this up. Yeah, not as outrageous as I thought it might be, at least initially when we saw the specs, and pricing and stuff like that was a bit unclear and whatnot. But yeah, anyway, I guess I'll wait to see what your thoughts are on this thing. What do you think about the name and just the product itself before I waffle on anymore? Be sure to comment below and I'll read those comments, and that'll help me, well, further form and shape my opinion of this product moving forward. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe. You can do those YouTube related things. And if you want more than just the YouTube related, you want a bit of extra Hardware Unboxed spice, then check us out over at Floatplane or Patreon. You get access to our exclusive Discord server, monthly live streams, behind the scenes content, and Q&A. So check that out if you're interested. But if not, that's perfectly fine. And I would like to thank you for watching this review. I'm your host, Steve. See you next time.